And good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode is titled Beyond the Legend, Cesar Chavez and the Farm Workers Movement. I'm joined by Matthew Garcia. Professor Garcia is the Ralph and Richard Lazarus Professor of History, Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies and Human Relations at Dartmouth College. Today is February the 24th. I want to thank you for joining us again. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs at the Center. On behalf of my team, my staff, Jira and Mike and Meredith, I want to thank you for joining us for another evening. I know many of you are either still in your classrooms if you're on the West Coast, or perhaps commuting home, getting back to your families, or maybe you've just sort of eddied out from your own family work to come and join us. And I hope tonight's session is relevant and helpful for you as you consider these topics with your students. In particular, I see some very familiar faces and names in the room. I want to thank Carl for being here again. Carl's in Texas. Teresa in Iowa. Teresa, you always have great questions, and I particularly appreciated the 3 questions tonight that you posted in response to my opening prompt. Alice is here from Monterey Vista Elementary School. Charles is joining us from Tidewater, Virginia. Jason from Pismo Beach. Liliana from the Willow School in New Jersey. And as always, we have a lot of Los Angeles folks who are joining us through the airwaves tonight. Jovita, Kayla, Mirta, Leodor, Pilar, Felicia, Guillermo, thank you so much for joining us. Please do share the information about upcoming webinars with your colleagues and with your friends. It's funny, this morning I woke up, I don't know how you guys set your alarms. I tend to set my alarm on crooked numbers. Somehow it just psychologically gets me up more quickly. And so my alarm was set for 6:03 a.m., 6:03. And of course, the smartest thing that, or perhaps the most sinister thing that our phones have done is to put all of our sleep alarms and our traffic on these devices. So of course, the first thing my hand touched was my cell phone. And of course, I'm still just waking up, maybe in that hazy space between sleeping and waking. An email popped in, and it was from a current fellow at the National Humanities Center. As you know, each year we welcome somewhere between, 32 and 36 university professors and academics who come from institutions all over the country and increasingly internationally. And if selected based on their project idea, they come to Durham, they come to the center on a daily basis, and they do nothing but their work. They do nothing but their research. They're completely unencumbered by anything else in their professional lives, and they have complete intellectual freedom. But that doesn't mean that they sort of stay hermits in this little Jedi center out in the woods. They are still deeply connected to the world we live in, and their research is often very relevant to help us understand that. And the email that I'm describing came from a fellow from Wittenberg University, Christian Raffensperger, who I've enjoyed lunch with on numerous occasions. He's a great guy. But he emailed and he essentially said, listen, I am an expert in Russia and Ukraine, and I would love to do a webinar to help teachers understand how to describe what's happening under our feet around us all the time, so they can speak more clearly and more accurately with their students. So I'm very, very pleased to announce a pop-up webinar that we just added this morning. We pulled this together in about 4 hours. We added it to the schedule. On March the 16th, Christian will be joining us to present a webinar on the crisis in the Ukraine, providing some historical context. There's no way of knowing what will happen in the next 2.5 or 3 weeks, how much the current events will shift and evolve. But what he will be able to do is tie that into and Putin's decision to invade Ukraine to a much larger historical context. The registration is currently open. We have added it to the website, so please do take a moment to go to the registration button in the digital library. It's that gold button in the upper left-hand corner. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, you can sign up for this. And please do share it with your colleagues, your departments, your networks. We would love to have educators at all levels join us for this sort of emergency pop-up webinar. And I want to thank Christian for offering to do so. Of course, the work that Christian shares and the work that we share with you tonight, and all the work that we produce at the center, is found in our open education library, the Humanities Class Digital Library. And this is the space where you can get the readings, you can get the resources, and the recordings of our webinars once they've concluded. I do encourage you to take a look at the readings that each of our scholars provides in advance. Listen, I know you guys are super busy right now, and so it may be that you glance through them. It may be that you familiarize yourself a little bit with the current and main themes. But what's most likely going to be the case is you'll go back afterwards after attending these live events, and you'll spend more time with websites and articles like the ones that Professor Garcia has shared with us tonight. This is where you can find all that, and you do know that in this OER library, it's free and open for you to use in your classroom. We've got about, including Christian's new pop-up webinar, we've got, I think, 12 episodes left in this year's session. If you find yourself caught short some professional development credits, or if you just missed your weekly connection with the National Humanities Center, I do encourage you to consider some of our online courses. We've got 12 titles that are currently in planning for the spring session 2, which begins on March the 21st. I don't have the information with me right now, but I should also say that we will be offering some summer sessions that will be condensed so that you can complete them in more time, in quicker time. So keep an eye out on our upcoming emails, and always go to our websites to see those. And I will remind you for the last time, actually, because the deadline is March the 1st, next week, that we are accepting applications to our 2-week Teacher Institute in July, titled Contested Territory, America's Involvement in Southeast Asia, 1945 to 75. We will bring up to 36 teachers from wherever you are to Durham for 2 weeks. We'll be offering you a $2,200 stipend, and you'll be coming to the center every day to work with scholars who are experts in the field to unpack and really better understand the complicated layers of Southeast Asia, culturally, historically, politically, linguistically, through literature. We intended to use all the humanities to better understand this relationship. And my last announcement tonight is to let you know that the application period for next year's Teacher Advisory Council will open on March the 1st as well. I'm deeply indebted and grateful for all the contributions of the 20 TAC members that you see listed on the screen. We would love to have any of you who regularly attend and would like to be more directly involved with the work that we do and put together on behalf of teachers. We would love for you to apply. So please do consider doing so, and we'll be announcing next year's cohort by the end of this school year. Tonight's webinar is an audio and PowerPoint only webinar. I don't know about you guys, but I get a little tired of looking at myself on Zoom. So I find it a little refreshing to be able to speak to you without the distraction of our video component. What it does mean, though, is that the volume is super important. If for some reason the audio becomes muffled or low or crackly, there's 2 very quick solutions that seem to solve most problems. Number one, turn up your volume button. It's located just there underneath the headshot, which is of me right now. And secondly, you can log out and come back in without disrupting your attendance log or disrupting the live event. Your participation in the chat box is going to be really important. Please do use that to share questions and thoughts, and I'll be bringing those to Professor Garcia at various points. So again, welcome and thank you for joining us for tonight's Humanities in Class webinar. It's titled Beyond the Legend, Cesar Chavez and the Farm Workers Movement. I'm joined by Professor Matthew Garcia from Dartmouth College. I also want to thank Kathy Keffler for joining us tonight as our TA. Kathy's a member of this year's TAC and a teacher in the Douglas Rapid City School District in Rapid City, South Dakota. Kathy, thank you for joining us. She'll be in the chat box sharing some resources that she's identified and generally keeping the conversation going. So, Professor, thank you again for joining us. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great.
Thank you, Andy. Can you hear
me? Of course.
Yes,
we can, and thank you for joining. And before I hand over the keys to the slide deck here and invite you to lead us through tonight's presentation, I wonder if you'll do me the favor of responding to the same prompt that I asked the teachers, the audience, to tonight. There it is. Hey, Professor, if you could ask Chavez one question, what would it be?
Well, I would ask him why he didn't follow through on the success of the boycott, which is the thing I'm going to focus on today. That was a question that I had as I was doing the research, and I think I have some answers, but I'll be interested to hear what people say tonight. I want to start by just thanking Andy Mink and Jared Lego, who have been helpful in navigating the website, and also just the National Humanities Center for doing this kind of programming. I've been doing this work and interfacing, particularly with school teachers, for a very long time, way back in the Teach for America days. And it's really refreshing to be able to talk to other educators or educator to educator. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the land, the ancestral lands of the Abenaki, where Dartmouth College sits in the Upper Valley of New Hampshire and Vermont. So I'm going to go ahead and start the slides. I just want to say that I acknowledge, I saw in the audience chat, and I connect very much with people who say they have a personal connection to Cesar Chavez. Some of you talked about having grandparents or parents that picked fruit, picked vegetables, were doing farm work. I had that similar personal connection. My Mexican side of my family, I come from a mixed Mexican Anglo family. The Garcias, the Martinezes, the Albas, they were farm workers, and they traveled up and down California, picking various fruits from citrus to cotton to grapes. So I was immediately drawn to Chavez, and when I went to college at UC Berkeley, I learned, like many Californians, about the legend of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, that he is, if not the greatest, certainly among the greatest Latinos that have ever been a part of this great nation. I also lived through a period where I saw name changes of streets and buildings that began to be graced with his name and honor the work that Cesar Chavez did. And through that process, I began to ask questions, more deep questions about who he is, and to engage the legacy. As I became a formal historian, a PhD student, I started to encounter a more diverse and more nuanced history of the farm workers movement that sort of went beyond Cesar Chavez and asked me to, it challenged me to ask questions about the legacy. So a couple of the questions that I had on my mind as I entered into this second book, I wrote a first book about the citrus workers of Southern California, and that was from the bottom up, the workers' perspective. But I was really interested in those advocates for farm workers like Cesar Chavez that was trying to bring justice to the fields. And for me, I was really impressed that we talked about a farm worker movement, and that when we talk about a movement, we're talking about it being a social movement, right? And so I started to ask the question, well, if it was a social movement, why do we celebrate an individual? And then eventually, as the legend of Dolores Huerta gets woven in, and she's now the female version of that great leader that Cesar Chavez was celebrated as in the 80s and 90s when I was going through school in California. Why do we celebrate just individuals when it was a social movement? Who else made this movement move? The second question I had was that I was curious why, if the farm workers movement was so successful, why were farm workers still amongst the most exploited, the most poorly paid, the most disempowered members in our working society? What happened? If the farm workers movement had liberated them, had brought a degree of social justice, why were they still the downtrodden? And so as I started to ask those questions, I thought, well, there must be something that they did succeed at, and there must be a reason why Cesar is so lauded and lionized. And so I began to explore, what exactly did he do? What exactly did the farm worker movement achieve? But I also started to ask the question of, what did they get wrong? Because there had to be some reason why those gains that were made in the 1960s and 70s didn't follow through into the era that I was living in. And so I think we got to begin with the question of, what was the farm workers movement? Where did it come from? I should just note that I will stop every 10 or 15 minutes to take questions, and I want this to be a dialogue. And we're going to cover roughly 2 decades. But I think it's really important to recognize that the farm worker movement actually predates the 1960s, and there were rural uprisings amongst the farm workers of that era in the 1930s that struck against cotton producers and demanded a new deal for farm workers. And that, in some ways, resulted in the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, but curiously and really in ways that disappointed farm workers, they were not included in the rights that came with the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, namely that they were not granted collective bargaining rights. They couldn't get together and as a group say, we want this for our sector of the economy. Worse, as we move forward into the middle of the 20th century, their jobs began to get eroded and taken away from them by guest workers that were invited into California and throughout the West, braceros. And these braceros came from 1942 to 1964 under the pretext that they were filling jobs that people that were going to the front lines of World War II had left, and they had to come. But in fact, the majority of the contracts that were issued for the Bracero program happened after World War II. And so it became a way in which the farm owners could really suppress wages and, in fact, expel workers that were troublemakers. And it also blocked the ability of those that were in the United States who had done farm work for a very long time, who had been on the front lines of those strikes in the 1930s, to actually organize unions. So in many ways, the farm worker movement comes about as a way of trying to end that system. And Cesar Chavez was very committed to it, to ending that system. He did it primarily through this organization that is a very important organization, the Community Service Organization. And you see a young Chavez there with a mustache to the right. And he's standing there with, at the center is Fred Ross and also Edward Roybal. And this organization was very committed to empowering Mexican Americans to demand rights and to demand privileges that they could get through the ballot box, access to the ballot box. But for him, he came from Yuma, Arizona. He came from a farm working family. He had lost his ranch during the Great Depression. And so he was very committed to helping rural families in California. So it wasn't just empowering Mexican Americans, but it was about empowering rural Mexican Americans. And so one of the first places he went to was Oxnard, California, which is a citrus growing region. I was very committed to achieving those goals of empowering those communities. But in that experience, he realized that, in fact, the problem wasn't just disempowerment, it was a problem of labor. And that, in fact, what he needed to do is maybe start a farm workers union. So it was through him and his wife, Helen Chavez, that they began to build a network really around Helen's home, which is Delano, California, and not in Arizona where he is from, nor in Oxnard. It was really Delano, which was the heart of the San Joaquin Valley. And he met a couple people, and I think it probably surprises people to recognize, to realize that it wasn't always Mexican Americans at the center of this movement. In this period of time, there were people who were priests who were interested in making change through their faith. And one of those people was Jim Drake, who was from New York City, and he was actively trying to resolve the poor living conditions for farm workers. And he met a man also, Gilbert Padilla, who was previously an onion picker. He was actually working in dry cleaning at the time, but he was also motivated by the desire to change the trajectory of Mexican Americans in these rural places, and bought into the CSO's idea that they could be empowered to change the world that they occupied. So one of the things that Cesar achieved, and Gilbert was extraordinarily skillful at this as well, was to go into the homes of the local Mexican people and do house meetings and persuade them to become activated and to make demands, to voice their concerns. Jim Drake worked with these men to also make fuel more available for transporting themselves to their jobs, to make housing more affordable, and to have rentals that were clean and sanitary. And so it's this kind of network that started happening, and it was at the core an interracial network, and to some extent intergenerational. A member of this group was also Dolores Huerta. And so one of the things that they realized very quickly was that they were not making any progress by making local appeals to growers, nor protesting at the site of where they were working. Part of the problem with farm work activism is that it's out in the fields. It's out of sight and out of mind of the majority of people that consume products that come out of the field. And that's one of the reasons why farm workers never saw very much any justice prior to the 1960s. But Dolores was extraordinarily skillful, as was Gilbert, in terms of appealing to an urban audience. And it was through Jim Drake's suggestion that we go to the cities when the harvest is not in session, so during the winter. And it was the dynamism and the speaking abilities of Gilbert Padilla and Dolores Huerta that took that message to places first like San Francisco and Los Angeles, then eventually across the country to New York City. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
You know, we've got some questions that are starting to queue up, and I think the first question I'd like to bring to you, and I think this is just to set a baseline, particularly for those in our audience who are not on the West Coast or perhaps not in a rural or agricultural environment. Talk to us a little bit and be as clear as you can about specifically what the infrastructure of this kind of agricultural work is. So when you're talking about farm workers, can you give us some examples, or can you describe what that work actually is?
Yeah, it was backbreaking work, literally. One of the things that the farm workers had to use, it was regarded as an instrument of torture, was the short-handled hoe. If you think about a hoe, if you buy it at the hardware store, it's got a long handle, you don't have to bend over. But in order for farm workers to get to many of the things that they were harvesting, they would have to bend over, and they would have to hack at the ground with a hoe that was short and force them to be bent over all day. One of the things that Cesar Chavez did with the help of many of these volunteers was to ban the short-handed hoe. And that was something that earlier activists had tried and failed at doing. The other aspect was that many of the farm owners washed their hands of the responsibility of proper housing and sanitation where people lived. And so often they were left to their own devices and to find their housing, and were exploited by people that were trying to profit from their desperation in urban places like Fresno, where they took up a place to live. So these were some of the things. The other things that would happen was that foremen would often abuse their authority by having access to the women who worked in the field, or many women complained about not having a proper place to relieve themselves, and therefore they were having to go to the bathroom in full view of their male peers and the people that were managing the field. So it was a very degrading experience, and dignity is a big part of this. The movement was really not just trying to change the materiality of the farm workers' lives, but also the lack of dignity in the work that was happening.
Thank you. This question comes from Amy. Amy's in Charlottesville, Central Virginia. She's wondering if you can talk a little bit about the role or lack of role of children in this kind of work.
Yeah, so child labor had always been a problem in farm work. In my first book, I actually documented the presence of what many of the farm worker families called ratas, and these were younger children that would scurry around the bottom of the trees and would pick up the fallen fruit and would add to the ability of the family to collect enough fruit to actually enhance their profits for the day. And that kind of family labor was encouraged by the farm owners, who actually profited, of course, from the greater yields that came by way of that. Of course, the children were then denied the ability to get an education at a young age, and that there was incentive for parents, in fact, desperation of parents to keep their kids from going to school. So it was a kind of cascading effect of the poor wages and the organization of the family unit as a kind of farm working enterprise or unit to raise money for the family.
Thank you. Last question before we move on. I'm going to bring in Jeff's question. Jeff is in Decatur, Illinois. The truth is, we could probably Google this and get the actual math and the stats. So rather than ask you to repeat those, I wonder if you can just give us a really clear landscape of the kind of produce that we're talking about, the kinds of fields, the kinds of harvest, and the percentage and the importance of that in the overall American landscape.
Yeah, this is incredibly important to the success of the farm worker movement. And so there's citrus, there is asparagus, there's various other products that are being picked. But the one thing that's most important are grapes. And the thing about grapes is that they are perishables, particularly table grapes. So they don't last long in a crate. They need to get to market quickly. And this was the thing that the farm workers used to their advantage when they started to boycott that particular item. There was an early experimentation with boycotting that was against wine, but wine only gets better as it ages in a bottle, and so there was kind of limited success at that. It was actually when they turned to table grapes and took advantage of the perishability of the grapes that it actually helped catalyze the movement and led them to success.
That's really a great point. Thank you for illustrating that. Thank you for the questions to the audience. Again, please do use the Ask the Professor tab or Ask Professor Garcia tab to submit a formal question, and I'll bring this forward in our next pause. Thank you.
So as I was saying, is that a lot of the movement depended on a network of people that trusted one another and could be innovative on the fly. And so Dolores Huerta was one of them. I should say that Cesar Chavez was really dubious of the boycott and thought, well, what else are we going to do with people when they are not on the front lines striking in the fields during the harvest? Might as well let them go try stopping the grapes or stopping the produce from getting to the market. And people like Dolores and Gilbert and Jim Drake really proved that the boycott was and ultimately became the heart and soul of the movement. And it wasn't until they started to boycott those grapes that were trying to get to New York City, and in particular Manhattan, that they started to realize that success. So one of the things that restricted many organizations from engaging in boycotts was the Taft-Hartley Act. This was an act in 1947 that rolled back some of those collective bargaining rights and those actions that came with the National Farm Workers, the Wagner Act that I mentioned in 1935. But because farm workers were not included in those restrictions, they could use the boycott. They could boycott against supermarkets. They could do whatever they wanted, but they could also appeal to allied unions first that received the grapes in New Jersey and then would transport them across the river into to Manhattan. And so the initial move for the farm workers in Dolores Huerta was to appeal to longshoremen to not transport those grapes. But very quickly, the farm owners learned that they could get an injunction against those longshoremen for violating the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. So the fact that the farm workers were not included in the National Labor Relations Act meant that they could then take the battle to the stores. And that's where Dolores went next. So rather than appeal to allied unions to not transport the grapes, she started to stand on the front lines of the stores, in the parking lots, on the sidewalks, asking consumers not to buy those grapes. And so smartly, she would direct her actions towards communities that were inclined to be sympathetic towards the farm workers. So you might have seen the film In the Heights. You know that Washington Heights is a place that has historic Latino and African American population, and really understood the problems of civil rights and the aggrieved conditions for many farm workers. And she was able to stop those grapes from being bought in those stores, so much so that the managers of the stores would come out and say, okay, we'll remove the grapes. We won't sell grapes in our store. Will you please remove your picket signs from the front of our store? And she came up with an incredibly important device, which was the hostage store tactic. And what she would do is say, okay, now that you've agreed to take the grapes off of your shelves, I need you to appeal to the AMP in Lower Manhattan, and I need you to appeal to the AMP in Brooklyn and all over the greater New York area before I remove my protest from the front of your store. And so she literally took that Washington Heights store hostage in order to spread the effect of blocking grapes and removing grapes from these stores. It was an ingenious thing. And the boycott becomes a kind of site of protest innovation. So in Seattle, this is where they came up with the idea of human billboards. Today we see it when we go to suburban malls and we see people spinning signs and advertising insurance and cell phones and what have you. The first time this was used was actually on the boycott lines throughout the United States, but the first place it was used was in Seattle. And the boycott then began to expand into a network of houses that was filled with a lot of volunteers that came from various sectors of society. Sometimes it was religious leaders, sometimes it was farm workers themselves, but actually pretty rarely was it farm workers, because they were in such a difficult financial situation that they had to keep moving and keep chasing other farm work in other states. So the farm worker movement depended on all of these volunteers, and one of the most significant volunteers was young people. Many college students, took what you might say a gap year today, but would take time off from school and actually join the ranks of the boycott and join a boycott house in their neighborhood, or even travel across country to join a boycott house to have a kind of unique experience and to contribute to the movement. I think it's also important to recognize that this is a period of heightened social consciousness. And it was also a period in which other movements started to move away from a kind of interracial approach to social justice. So the Black Power movement is in formation towards the latter part of the 1960s, largely because of the aggressiveness of police violence and the deaths of many leaders in the Black Panther Party. And so it becomes very much a movement for Blacks only. And in many ways, the farm worker movement was maybe the last best hope for interracial activism for the benefit of a worthy cause. And one of those people that contributed time and innovation was Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown was a graduate student at Cornell University, and he was aspiring to write a dissertation about the farm workers and write about Delano. And that's where he went as a young graduate student. And he met Cesar Chavez, and he says, I want to write the great dissertation, ultimately the great book about this movement. And he said, Cesar said to Jerry, he's like, look, you have a lot of skill, you have a lot of energy, but I'm not going to grant you access to this community unless you put some time in and you apply yourself to the betterment of this movement. And so Jerry sunk in and began to organize the boycott, and Cesar and the group benefited greatly from his expertise. One of the things he figured out was, rather than chasing the carloads of grapes going all over the United States and beyond, actually going to Canada, trying to find that tipping point when the farm owners would finally concede and come to the bargaining table, realized that those farm workers, those farm owners could keep moving those grapes and exhausting this ragtag group of activists. But Jerry realized that, in fact, if they concentrated all their resources on 10 cities where more than 50% of the grapes were sold, and they could block at least 20% of the grapes being delivered to those cities, then that would be the linchpin. That would be the key to bringing the farm workers, the farm owners to their knees. And in fact, you can't see very closely in this document, but it shows you the changes over time in terms of what were the losses in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago and San Francisco. And you can see, if you look very closely, they did much better than 20% in most of the cities. And so what ended up happening was that it really forced, it concentrated, it honed the activities of the farm workers and the boycott to specific cities. And they started to share tactics by sharing and producing newsletters that said what was going on in Philadelphia. How did we stop the grapes or get the grapes out of the supermarkets? How did we convince people to turn around the parking lot and go somewhere else in Cleveland? And this was, in many ways, the ways in which social media work today, but they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have TikTok. This is what they used, and they used mail to do this. So the farm owners thought that they could just beat the UFW by continuing to move their sales to another place. Okay, you're going to shut down New York. Well, we'll move to Philadelphia and sell until you are exhausted. Well, we're going to shut down Philadelphia now. The farm workers would say. Well, then the farm owners would move the majority of their production across the international line to Canada. And this is Jessica Govea and Marshall Gans. They were a romantic pair, but Jessica was also a farm worker's daughter from Bakersfield. And they traveled that distance to Canada and helped block the grapes in Montreal and Toronto. So I'll stop there and see if there's questions.
Thank you. And we do have some questions that have come in. The first comes from New Haven. Tisha, it's always great to see you. Thank you for joining us. Tisha is wondering if you could say a little bit more about the interracial nature of the movement, perhaps the bonds formed with Filipino workers, for example.
Yes. So the Filipino workers were really the beginners of the movement. And I went right by that part because I wanted to get to the boycott part of it. And I should not have, because without the Filipino workers, there would be no way that the farm worker movement would have gotten off the ground in the 1960s, early 1960s. In 1962, Filipinos in Stockton, in Asparagus, struck for better wages. In 1964 and 65, they were striking in Coachella and won increases in the prices that they were, or the salaries, or excuse me, the pay that they were getting for harvesting citrus. And it was actually the Filipinos, in particular, Lariat Leong, who was someone that had worked in lettuce. He had lost a finger from doing that work, had traveled up and down the West Coast from Alaska all the way down to Southern California and back again, with this incredible experience as a farm worker, but also someone who came from a radical tradition. He was communist. He believed very much in organizing workers for the benefit of creating a union and putting pressure on the owners of industry to negotiate collectively. And he actually began working with the AFL-CIO and taking money from them to help stoke those processes of organizing farm workers. And eventually, it's because of it, Leong, and it's because of the Filipinos that they prodded Cesar Chavez into organizing a union, not just going around home by home and asking Mexican people to stand up for their rights and to be engaged in electoral politics. It was the Filipinos that said, you need to go beyond that, and you need to join with us to form a union. And in 1965 in Delano, that's where it happened. And it had actually happened in a place called Filipino Hall in Delano.
Thank you. In a similar vein, Bob, who is in Austin Independent School District in Texas, is wondering if there are either inspirations from or parallels that you can draw with the civil rights movement, with the activists of the late 50s and 60s. How did those things merge, and how did this movement draw from that?
So I think this movement learned a bit from the civil rights movement by the influence of religion. So as you know, King was a reverend. He drew from other faith leaders like Rabbi Heschel and other faith leaders to create an interfaith and intergenerational movement, an interracial movement, actually, for those civil rights achievements that King achieved. The UFW is very similar. As I mentioned, there are people like Jim Drake, but there were also Catholic priests that began to question the ways in which the Catholic Church had really supported a lot of the farm owners and the families that kind of dominated the local parishes in the Central Valley, and started to turn particular priests in favor of organizing with Protestants like Jim Drake, and to create an interfaith movement in the interest of the farm workers. And so I think that's a big similarity. I would say this was unusual for a labor movement, and people like Walter Reuther, who was a big supporter of the farm workers, actually questioned that initially. And a lot of the labor leaders of that time really was dubious of the idea of bringing religion into the movement. But Cesar did not fear that. And in fact, he saw the benefits of drawing on images that were familiar to farm workers to get them to join this movement. So the Virgin of Guadalupe becomes this really important galvanizing symbol for the movement that he carries in front of the marches that he did up and down the Central Valley to Sacramento to carry his message to lawmakers in California. So I think religion is one of the kind of commonalities between the Black Civil Rights Movement and the UFW and the farm workers movement.
And of course, we've got some follow-up questions for several of the answers you've just provided. The first one goes to Armin. Armin is in Los Angeles Unified and is wondering if you think that Larry Elong and the help for the Filipino farm workers were not given enough credit, if mentioned at all.
Absolutely, and this is one of the reasons why I started this project, frankly, which was that at the very beginning of the project, I was recognizing that the Filipinos were the most active. They exhibited the most courage in terms of confronting the farm owners. They were the ones that were willing to bring ideology into the movement. This was something that, which we'll see later in the story, Cesar was never quite comfortable with. But this continues to be a fight. So one of the readings that I recommended and that I put in on the website is a review of the 2014 biopic of Cesar Chavez by Diego Luna, in which the Filipinos are given short shrift, and many Filipino viewers and the children, descendants of those activists that were in the farm workers movement, such as Larry Leong's son, really objected to the characterization of Filipinos as sideshow, the bit players in this movement. They were the movers and shakers. They were the ones that generated a lot of the energy that lifted that farm worker movement at the beginning. One of the reasons why the Filipinos did not continue as a dominant force in the movement was because many of these Filipinos were aged. They were approaching their 60s, and their concerns were about retirement. Their concerns were about, what am I going to have when I can't do this work anymore? As for the Mexican workers, they were younger. There were more of them because of its proximity to Mexico, and also because of the constant flow of Mexican immigrants that had been coming since before the 20th century. And so ultimately, when they were making that decision about becoming a union, there was a discussion: should it be Larry Leong or should it be Cesar Chavez? Well, the decision was made that Leong would be the vice president, largely because of demographics, that the majority of the farm workers were and would continue to be Mexican American, and it was important for Cesar Chavez to be that face of the movement. It was assumed that Cesar would continue to honor the Filipino presence and the importance of Filipino workers, and in many ways he failed. One of the first people to defect from the union was Larry Leong in 1972, who objected to a lot of things, including the neglect of the Filipino Concerns and the movement of the headquarters out of Delano, where most of the Filipino and Mexican people who made the movement happen existed. And they moved it up to the foothills of the Tehachapi Mountains, where they were gifted this place called La Paz that was far removed from the farm worker communities that gave the movement its vitality.
Thank you. Maybe two more questions before we move on. The next one's from Fabiola, who asks if the boycotts resulted in instances of arrest or violence perpetrated by law enforcement.
I did not identify many instances where law enforcement played that role with the boycott. There were moments where they were arrested for doing creative things like taking helium balloons full of UFW, confetti, and letting the balloons go into, letting the balloons loose inside the store. And then when the store clerks popped the balloons, that confetti would come down, right? So for those kind of things, they were escorted out of the store. But in terms of police violence, there was not police violence in urban sectors where most of these boycotts happen. Really, the danger and the abuse at the hands of law enforcement was happening in the rural areas, which were predominantly controlled by the farm owners. So a lot of the things you see in documentary films about people being bloodied, people being beat up, not just by goons that were hired by the farm owners, but also Teamsters, which is another a competing union. But it was also sheriff departments that were involved in beating up those people. But that was on the strike lines, not on the boycott lines. And the boycott lines, there was really a kind of nod towards greater civility. And also there was a notion that it would really hurt the image of the stores that would call in the police to do those kind of things to protesters. I think it's also important to recognize too that the people that were carrying the boycott to the cities were not always farm workers. They were more typically college students or priests, and so they resembled the majority of the consumers that were buying those grapes and buying that fruit. And so it wasn't the kind of racial violence that we now associate with police violence in minority communities.
You may not know this, Professor, but we edit the recordings of our webinars so that the attendees can have access to them afterwards. We have the full, complete webinar recording, but we also sort of section them up by topic. And I want to tell my audience that we will be sure to erase the part about the graffiti balloons in case they share these with their students. That's exactly what a middle school student would love to have access to. One last question. This one comes from Jamie. Jamie's in Three Rivers School District in Central California. She's wondering if you can just describe for us what the crate fruit, the grape labels look like at this time. Was there propaganda? What did the labels look like?
The labels advertising the grapes?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, well, they were bucolic. They were scenes of sweetness and fecundity, and it was the kind of thing that farm owners use to market their produce, usually in colder regions away from California, usually across the country during winter. This started with sun-kissed. Even the name sun-kissed, the idea that the fruit, the oranges are sun-kissed, was a kind of selling point. And so in many ways, the boycott was countering those images, was associating this fruit with oppression, with exploitation, with abuse. And so it was a struggle. And in fact, what happens is the farm workers movement finds that art is a way of tampering with those images. And so you might have seen, Sun-Maid, right? Sun-Maid is raisins, but they were also targeted by the UFW. And there's a classic poster where the Sun-Maid woman is actually a skeleton. And it's a indication of the effect of picking grapes under those conditions in California. It is also familiar to Mexican people as calavera, or the image that's popular in the Day of the Dead. So it was also it had kind of double meaning and a connection to the people that were producing and consuming these images.
Great. Well, we have about a half an hour left. I'm going to save the questions that have queued up and invite our audience to continue to submit them. Why don't we move forward and we can pause again shortly.
Right. So when we last left the boycott story, the farm owners thought they could keep moving the grapes to avoid the boycott houses being successful in cities throughout North America. They eventually move across the international line into Canada, and the boycott meets them there. And eventually, this movement of grapes goes all the way. This is Jessica Gouveia marching in Montreal with other farm workers. And you see also members of clergy to her right. But eventually it goes across the Atlantic Ocean, where a young woman, Elaine Ellison, who was also a student at Cornell, but an undergraduate, had volunteered in those movements, in those boycott houses in New York City during the summer with Dolores Huerta. And she had decided that she was going to be a historian of ancient China. And some of the best collection of Chinese documents and Chinese artwork is in the London museums. And so she was studying those that evidence. She was actually looking at Chinese vases, and she was wondering, what am I doing here amidst this revolution in the United States, where we're making so much progress with the farm workers movement, and I'm sitting here in a dusty basement looking at ceramics. And so she calls Jerry Brown and says, I want to come back and get activated and join the movement again. And what Jerry says is, don't come back here, stop the grapes from going there. And in fact, that's what she does. So this is my favorite photo of my research, and this is Elaine Ellison, whose grandmother was a refugee from the Bolshevik Revolution. She was someone that had a kind of fighting spirit, and she channeled that into helping to stop the grapes, as they said in Britain, blacking the grapes, not allowing them to get to market. Now, the difference between England and the United States is that the labor laws in England allowed for unions to work with one another, whereas in New York, when Dolores tried to work with the longshoremen, the Taft-Hartley Agreement did not permit that allied activity. The labor unions and the longshoremen in England, and particularly on the Thames, where they're at here, could work with Elaine Ellison and block those grapes. This was in the critical year between 1969 and 1970. And in that time, the farm owners tried to move those grapes that they had first sent to England, to move them to Sweden, and then to Norway, and eventually to Hamburg, Germany. And Elaine single-handedly got on trains, planes, and automobiles and met those grapes at every single port, and worked with longshoremen in all of those countries to black the grapes, to block the grapes from getting to market. And they ended up rotting on the docks of Hamburg, Germany in 1970. That was the same year that finally the farm owners conceded to collective bargaining, to negotiations with Cesar Chavez, and the important grape contracts. The first in California history, many times people say it's the first in the U.S. history. There were contracts in Hawaii before this, but they really, for all intents and purposes, was the culmination of this incredible movement where finally there would be collective bargaining. And so this is what Cesar Chavez said about it. The consumer boycott is the only open door in the dark corridor of nothingness down which farm workers have had to walk for many years. It is a gate of hope through which they expect to find the sunlight of a better life for themselves and their families. And I think what's really important about this is that Cesar, at the beginning of this tactic, was dubious of its effectiveness, but it was the work of people like Dolores Huerta, of Gilbert, Padilla, of Jim Drake, of 21-year-old Elaine Ellison, the would-be PhD student Jerry Brown, and many, many others, really thousands of others, who made this moment possible, right? So by this point, then Cesar cannot doubt that the boycott is the most important tool that the farm workers have. Really important in terms of the memory of this moment and the ways this history is told, and is that when that 2014 film by Diego Luna documents this moment, it's not Elaine Ellison that's on the River Thames dumping grapes into the river. They place Cesar Chavez there. That never happened. And so for me, I was really frustrated, disgusted, frankly, at the ways in which those that made the film, those that informed the film, the filmmaker, really privileged a story of hagiography and Cesar Chavez as a singular leader who was the only one that could achieve these things, when in reality it was a social movement and a variety of people from different walks of life, from different generations, made that moment. And in many ways, it was a subversion of women in the movement, such as Elaine Ellison or Dolores Huerta. So I think I'll stop there and take some more questions, and then I'll answer the question, well, what happened after 1970? Because most of the farm worker history stops at this moment. And the 1970s really tells you a story of why farm workers have found justice elusive. So I'll stop there and take some more questions.
Yeah, this question comes from Sarah. Sarah's at San Joaquin Delta College, and you have addressed this a little bit, and I'm not sure if you can go into more detail, but she's curious about to know more about the role of women in the movement. And just in conclusion there, I think you hit on some of that, but can you flesh out a little bit more for her?
Yeah, I think I've emphasized the ways in which women exercise power, influence, courage in the movement up to this point. I think it's really important to also note that they had to overcome sexism in the movement, and that there were people who challenged their authority. The best example of that is Jessica Govea. So if I went back to that image of the 10 most important cities, and that their objective was to reduce the shipments by 20%, shipments actually went up by 3% to Montreal, which indicates that the growers were trying to move the grapes to compensate for the losses elsewhere. And those numbers actually suggested that Jessica was having a hard time managing the boycott there. That was Montreal was the site of her boycott house. But as I dug into the documents, I found that there were men, particularly young men, who felt that they could do better than her and challenged her. And she ended up having to fight against their sexism and to make appeals all the way to Delano and to Cesar to stop this abuse. And most of the people who were in charge, whether it be Cesar or it would be other people like Gilbert Padilla, they really were too far at a distance to do anything. And I think, in fact, it was assumed that, well, it comes with the territory. If you're going to, be active in a man's world, you're going to have to behave like a man. And that's, the assumption, right? That they had to be tough. And the reality was that they dealt with a lot of discrimination and sexism. There were also incidents of sexual violence and abuse in the boycott houses. And so it wasn't frequent, but there was documentation of that as well. So it was a difficult time for some women, but I don't want to sugarcoat it, but I think that's a really good question.
Great. Well, the next question I think I'm going to save because I suspect you're about to talk about it. Why don't we move through the last portion of your talk, and then we can bring all the final questions to you then.
Great. So, the question that I had at the beginning of this project was really there in 1970. This was supposedly the launching pad, the moment at which collective bargaining rights were supposed to run through the agricultural sector of California, that a national union was supposed to be created under the flag of the UFW, and that farm workers would finally experience justice. But we know that that didn't happen. And in fact, the UFW and its heirs recognize that today. But I would always find that the answers for why that happened from the official union were really unsatisfactory. And as I did the research, I found that it was just downright not true. So the perceptions that they created for why farm workers continue to be exploited after 1970s, and that they didn't make the gains, they didn't leverage that moment in the contracts in 1970, were some of these. First, growers were resistant to unions, right? And they never accepted the unions. The second is that the Republican Party in particular was in opposition to the UFW and fought the union even after the contracts were achieved in 1970, particularly Governor Reagan in California and then President Nixon. They also argued that the laws were against the UFW, right? That it favored the growers and favored the industry. And finally, a rival union, the Teamsters, tried to usurp the power that the UFW created with the boycott, and they created confusion among consumers about who exactly was representing farm workers. What I found in my research is a different reality. First of all, on that first question, did growers resist? Yes, they resisted, but by and large, after 1970, they had really accepted unionization. But the thing they disliked was the UFW's mismanagement of the hiring process. And in fact, in talking to many of the veterans of the movement in the union, they admitted that they had failed in creating a process of assigning farm workers to the field in a way that was really beneficial, not just to the farm workers, but to the growers. The question of Republican opposition is really countered by the fact that Governor Jerry Brown is elected in 1974 in California. He's a Democrat. He's not just a Democrat that comes in as, he favors the UFW. He actually works on behalf of the UFW. And still to this day, he says the thing that he is most proud of in his time as the governor is the execution of the California Agricultural Labor Relations Act. If that sounds familiar, it is, because it's a state version of that National Labor Relations Act that farm workers were denied access to in 1935, meaning they didn't get collective bargaining rights on a national level. Well, in 1975, Jerry Brown pushed through, with the help of legislators in California, a state-level Agricultural Labor Relations Act that allowed for collective bargaining for farm workers in the state. And finally, the Teamsters agreed. They did fight the UFW and did try to assert their power, but by 1976, they had basically agreed that the UFW was the union that would represent field workers. So what happened? There's a couple of problems. One is that Cesar Chavez never really got his head around the idea that someone who is not documented, who is not a citizen, could help the union. He was adamant against including undocumented immigrants in the union, and the the farm owners recognize this as a weakness. And so, like in the mid-century when they brought in braceros to kind of erode the ability of the farm workers to organize, they brought in undocumented immigrants to continue low wages and to continue the work in the field that they wanted to continue with at a very low rate. Cesar, rather than recognizing them as people that he could organize and weave into the union, called them chattels, meaning slaves. He frequently used the epithet illegals and went further and had a campaign in the 1970s, particularly 1973 and 74, that targeted undocumented immigrants for abuse and expulsion. He, in fact, supported the creation of what they called a wet line in Arizona that caught undocumented immigrants coming across the border and would beat them up and send them back to Mexico. So this was a weakness in many ways, because we know from organizations today like Justice for Janitors or SCIU that those unions that started to adopt undocumented workers in their union recognized that they would grow their ranks and grow their power. But this was beyond Cesar Chavez at that time. The other thing that Cesar Chavez failed to do was take advantage of the Agricultural Labor Relations Act. The reason for it is because he really got addicted to the boycott. The boycott brought him celebrity. It gave him access to the public, and people saw him as an authority. What ended up happening was that ALRB, the Agricultural Labor Relations Board that is created by the Labor Relations Act, is that it becomes the device by which farm worker justice is meted out, right? So now it's lawyers and boards of that are adjudicating and deciding how justice is going to be meted out. It's not the romantic and energizing experience of the boycott that centers Chavez and privileges his voice that makes things happen. And he resents that, and he particularly resents the lawyers. The other thing that he has to accede to is that it's no longer protest that makes the movement happen, it's state management. And there were problems with the Agricultural Relations Act in the first year, namely that it was not fully funded for all of the pent-up demands for justice that they needed to work through. So through the proposition system in California, they tried to extend that funding. They also tried to extend access to workers that they were trying to persuade to come into the union during their breaks and during their lunch hours. And that appeal failed. He took people off the boycott lines. He made them go out and advocate for Proposition 14. And the voters of California rejected him. And that really put him into a tailspin. He was very upset with that. He started to look for people that he saw as people that defied his orders to come away from the boycott and go into the advocacy for Proposition 14. And he reached for a kind of control that he saw in an allied organization known as Synanon, and from a friend who ran it, Chuck Dietrich. Now, Synanon was this alcohol and drug recovery organization that became an intentional community. Some would say a cult. And what they did is they would take former addicts and they would play this thing called the game, where they would ask people to be vicious to one another, to break each other down, and to call each other names. And Chuck Dietrich used that power to really create a community that was loyal to him. Cesar thought that he could expel all those people that did not follow his wishes, did not come from the boycott and advocate for Prop 14, and he would ferret out the people that had betrayed him by using this device called the game. Ultimately, it very much backfired on the union because many of the people that were there in the movement questioned these tactics and questioned his priorities. He became more and more withdrawn from the front lines of the movement and more withdrawn from the communities that the farm workers came from. I mentioned earlier that he relocated the center of the union in La Paz in the foothills of the Tehachapi Mountains away from Delano. And this was a space that was very negative for him because it allowed him to kind of obsess about the control that he didn't have and to reach even deeper for it. And so it created a struggle and a loss of focus that by 1977 ended in the defection or the expulsion of very important organizers such as Padilla and Eliseo Medina and Marshall Gams and a lot of the people that I've shown pictures of but haven't talked about here extensively. And the union really loses focus. And many people think that privately, before I wrote my book, that this was one of the reasons why the contracts were not leveraged for greater success. And it wasn't until my book came out that we started to break the silence on this. There's a couple other authors that I share with you. Frank Bardicke is one, Miriam Powell's another, and the three of us sort of produced a renaissance in the story of the farm workers movement and why it failed and how it failed in the 1970s. So what this leaves us with is, and there's my book, it leaves us with the questions of why we celebrate one individual and what are the dangers of celebrating one individual's achievements over the collective, whether it be those Filipinos that started it, whether it be Dolores Huerta that did the innovations with the boycott, whether it's Elaine Ellison that single-handedly stopped the grapes from reaching Europe. We lose focus on those people. We also lose focus on the importance of democracy in the union. And so I think what I'll do now is stop there. That might be shattering for some of you that have revered Chavez, and you might have questions, but I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, and you're absolutely right. We've got a lot of folks in the audience who have a deep knowledge of and experience with this topic. Imelda has commented in the audience chat that it's shocking to her. She had no idea that he was becoming obsessed with leadership, and that these certainly in the latter part of the 70s, these things were happening. So the questions that I'm going to bring forward all revolve around that kind of demystification of Chavez. Imelda again asks is it because he's an icon to the Latino population that nobody really seemed to talk much about his stance on illegal immigrants because they would cross the picket lines and didn't help his cause. Others are asking if the sexism that you alluded to might be why he was the face of the movement. Talk to us a little bit about just the construction of the icon that you've now pulled some layers back on.
Yeah. I think I've often said that Cesar Chavez was like Bank of America. He was too big to fail. And that's a condition that is created by the neglect of Latino history and communities of color in general and their roles in the United States. We don't have enough study of the many different people who are Latino that played significant roles in the history of this country. So what ends up happening is that we have this one person that's elevated to iconic levels and a symbol for all that's right and good with Mexican Americans specifically and Latinos in general. And so it prevents us from digging deeper and starting to reveal some of the less savory aspects of that history. It was the very simple question that I asked at the beginning of this presentation, at the beginning of my project. Why are farm workers still downtrodden? That led me to dig deeply into the archive. The other reason is that the UFW and Cesar Chavez in particular made a deal with an archivist in Detroit at Wayne State University at the Walter Reuther Library, which is really one of the best labor archives in the country, to archive all of the papers of the union in Detroit. That's far away from the people that were living and worshiping this union and this man. And so what I found is that it was my luck of becoming a professor at University of Illinois in the late 90s. And then I've been east of the Mississippi for most of my career and in proximity to Detroit. And I just kept going there for a labor conference every year and going into that archive. And I started seeing these letters that were questioning his loyalty to Chuck Dietrich and the behavior of Synanon and the game. And I saw the evidence that there was something awry. And I actually took some of my students when I was at Brown University to help me assess what was in that archive and to catalog it. We actually recovered some tapes of the game and tapes of the executive committee that was documenting the union just being torn apart in these moments. And one of my students, who is a young Mexican American from Chicago, came out after listening to those tapes for a full day, and she says, "I hate Cesar Chavez." And I said, "What are you listening to?" And that's when, I realized you could not allow the legacy to stand anymore. You had to tell a more complete history. Mm-hmm. And so, it's the evidence in the end, and that's the thing I want to emphasize to the audience. A good historian follows the evidence no matter where it goes. And so sometimes it takes us to places that's uncomfortable, and it runs counter to all the things we've been taught as young people. And, we feel like we need to believe in because, it's the thing that gives us purpose. But that does not help us get anywhere closer to farm worker justice, in my opinion.
Fantastic. You may or may not have seen in the audience chat as it was scrolling up that Lois, who is joining us from Grants Pass in Oregon, commented on just how nuanced and how much she appreciates what you shared. She's looking forward to reading your book. I'm going to take that compliment. I'm going to turn it into a question for you, Professor. Anytime you put scholarship out, there's going to be, if not criticism, at least folks are going to be considering your arguments and maybe offering different takes. Tell us what you think is the most effective counter to what you've shared tonight. It's always good when you think about what you're sharing to think about what the other side is. What would be the what would be the one thing that you haven't quite answered yet that someone on the other side of this question might bring forward?
Yeah, I think the question of what was Cesar up against, and was he someone that was confined and constricted by his obligations and relationships of the time, is a fair question to kind of counter my interpretation. And I often recognize that as a limitation. So for example, the AFL-CIO becomes the kind of parent or overarching national union that the UFW belongs to. And that union was very much against undocumented workers. It believed that only citizen workers could be organized and should be privileged to have collective bargaining rights. So in many ways, Cesar Chavez, when he rejected undocumented workers, was doing what a good union person would do, a good union leader would do in his time. But I think one of the things that distinguishes a great leader, a visionary leader, if you will, is one that transcends his time. And I would say, sadly, in this case, Cesar was in many ways a man of his time and a man of the institution he belonged to. That's not so much a criticism. It's more of an observation and an explanation of why, at least on the immigrant issue, he couldn't see the potential that other leaders later discovered with the organization of undocumented workers. We see this today with farm worker organizations such as PCUN in Oregon, or the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida and North Carolina, or in my home state with Migrant Justice and the dairy workers. Those organizations have succeeded, have gotten closer to farm worker justice because they have understood that that undocumented immigrants, or basically anybody who's in that sector of the economy who wants to organize and wants to advocate for justice and organize for justice, should be allowed to do so and empowered to do so, regardless of their citizenship status. And that's just something that Cesar couldn't see at that time.
Great. This question comes from Elizabeth in Sarasota, Florida. She's wondering about the role of the media in this story. How did the either local, state, regional, or national media portray this?
So the media was very enamored with Cesar Chavez. He was photogenic in many ways. He was someone that used devices that really worked with the public, and the media helped deliver it. So his fasts were really important. That's another aspect of this that I have not mentioned, but the fasts were really important. The fast was a device that he used to calm the passions and the violence of people that were following him, because yes, they were attacked in the fields, they were attacked on the strike lines by police, by Teamsters, by people that were hired by the farm owners. And so the natural inclination is to lash out, and there was backlash or farm worker violence against property and against farm owners. And it was his use of his own body in the fast that was so effective in really honing and channeling the energies towards a nonviolent and positive public presentation of the movement. And this is where I think Cesar achieved enormous advantages as an organizer and as a leader. I mean, I give him incredible credit for devising and using that tactic. Now, he got it from Gandhi, but he used it in a different context, which was really effective. And it was a dance with media that allowed for that to elevate the effect of it.
Yeah. Last question, Professor, and I'm going to share this question, but also frame it as an invitation for you to share a little bit more about the resources that I know you have on your website for critical thinking and addressing these topics. This question comes from Raina. Raina is a longtime attendee of our webinars. He's in Los Angeles. And Raina's got a bone to pick with you. I mean, how is he supposed to teach this now, knowing what he knows? How should our audience approach this topic, particularly our California teachers, when you've provided such depth and such nuance? How should he go about addressing Cesar Chavez now? And are there resources on your website that might assist in that?
Well, yes, I think that the benefit of teaching about Cesar Chavez as a flawed human being, as a leader that had his limits, is a kind of leader that is more approachable, more replicable for our students today. The Cesar Chavez that was infallible, that was an icon, was close to Jesus Christ. It wasn't someone that anybody could emulate. And in that, then, it means that the dream of farm worker justice died when he died in 1993. To recognize that there are reasons why he didn't succeed, and they are partly his own practices and his own beliefs, means that we can learn from those mistakes so that we can apply them to new attempts to achieve farm worker justice. And I think that this kind of approach is more beneficial, not only to future farm worker movements, but actually to Cesar Chavez himself, because in many ways, people thought they understood Cesar Chavez before myself, Marion Powell, who I put an article up for you to look at, Frank Bardicke, started to question the legacy, right? And I also think it's useful to teach with Diego Luna's film because it allows you to compare the image of Cesar Chavez in popular culture and the legacy that had been built up with the new reality of the new scholarship.
Professor Matt Garcia, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for sharing this story. I appreciate the depth that you've provided and the resources you've shared. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.
And I want to thank our entire audience for spending the last 90 minutes with us. Please do follow our social media feeds to see upcoming opportunities at the National Humanities Center for Teachers and Educators. That does include, again, the pop-up webinar we just added this morning on the historical context of Ukraine and today's invasion by Russia. Please share that with your colleagues, with your network, and with your departments. I hope to see you at a future webinar. Our next one is scheduled for March the 1st. It's next week. I'll be joined by Thomas McDowell from Ohio State. He'll be sharing his work on the historical roots of Black Panther in an episode titled Searching for Wakanda. Hope to see every one of you there. Have a great day at school tomorrow, wonderful weekend, and we'll work with you again in the near future. Thank you, everyone.
De colores se visten los campos en la primavera.